Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the second forum on understanding the mental health impact of hate. My name is Regina Cuellar. I'm Commissioner Cuellar, and I'm also the chairwoman of the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. So thank you so very much for joining us here today. I would like to go ahead and start just the review, the process for the closed captioning. Closed captioning is available for this meeting. The closed captions can be displayed in English or another language, which will allow you to view an automated live transcript of the meeting in another language, including Spanish, Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. To display closed captions on your screen, please do the following. Click the button labeled Show Captions at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you'd like to display captions in another language, select the box at the bottom of the window labeled Enable Translation. You will see a window with the heading, You've enabled translation at the top. Select English as a speaking language and select your preferred language in a second menu. Click Save. Automated captions in your selected language should start appearing at the bottom of the Zoom window. We'll send the instructions in Spanish in the chat as well. Next, I'm going to go ahead and do a land acknowledgement. Sekasin, I am Regina Cuellar, chairwoman of the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, once also known as the Sacramento Verona Band of Homeless Indians. It is an honor to welcome you all to my ancestral homelands, which span over 7 California counties, including Sacramento, where many of our major village sites are located. From the beginning of time, we have lived and gathered in these spaces along the Sacramento and American rivers. In fact, the land we sit on today is a village of Kadema, which is part of the unceded ancestral homelands, waterways, and cultural landscapes of the Nisenan people, my ancestors and the birthplaces of my grandmothers and grandfathers. Let us all acknowledge that the Sacramento region has also been a gathering place for many other tribes local to the surrounding area. Let us all reflect on the sacredness of the first peoples of this land, these shared spaces, histories, and traditions, while remembering the elders and ancestors who came before us, the ancestors who fought to survive so that we could be here today. Buena moko, good day. Welcome to the Second Commission on the State of Hate Community Forum. We are happy to be here at the Sacramento State University and to welcome members of the public in person and virtually. We appreciate your participation in this forum and hope you will learn or deepen your knowledge when hearing from the experts and organizations presenting this afternoon. We also encourage you to provide comments and feedback after the presentations or at the end of the forum. The Commission is deeply committed to receiving community feedback, and your input is critical for helping build the foundation of the Commission's work. Before the other commissioners introduce themselves, we want to highlight the California versus Hate resource line and network, a new and important resource available to people targeted for hate. California versus Hate is a non-emergency hate incident and hate crime reporting system to support individuals and communities targeted for hate. If you are a victim or witness to hate, racism, or bullying, you can receive free support. The hotline will help identify options for next steps after a hate act and make connections to community-specific resources, including legal, financial, mental health, and mediation services. Anyone can report anonymously, and your report will not be shared with law enforcement without your consent unless required by law. Report hate by calling 833-8-NO-HATE or visiting californiaversushate.org. So before I call on, I'd like to introduce all the other commissioners. I'll be calling on first Commissioner Levin.
Just thank you for that beautiful introduction. And again, the level of expertise that we're getting to evaluate today is a wonderful hallmark of this commission and its work. And I think it's important to recognize that this is a state where from the top down, the administration and the employees uplift people and care for people in vulnerable communities. So God bless you and thank you so much for holding this forum and doing this tremendous job. This is a lot of work. I was at a university for 24 years And when you put together these kinds of public forums and you have these top experts, it's a real important bridge for the public and the academic community and those who are serving particular communities. So thank you so much. I mean, it's a really wonderful job, a wonderful list of experts that you and the staff and Commissioner Filer put together. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner Levin. And Commissioner Southers, if you can just introduce yourself.
Sure. Commissioner Quayle, again, if I could echo the compliments of Commissioner Levin. I'm Errol Southers, and I also serve on the subcommittee on recommendations for law enforcement. I am a associate senior vice president at the University of Southern California, and I also serve on the LA Board of Police Commissioners. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Southers. Chair Roybal.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Russell Roybal. I chair the Commission on the State of Hate. I live and work in San Diego, California. Welcome, and thank you again to Commissioners Filer and Quayle for putting together the event today.
Thank you, Commissioner Roybal. Now to Commissioner Sinar.
Hi, everybody. Shireen Sinar. I'm a professor at Stanford Law School. I work on issues related and teach on issues related to civil rights and political violence, and I live in Palo Alto, California.
Thank you. And thank you to all the commissioners that are here. And last but not least, Commissioner Filer.
Hi, welcome everyone. I am Commissioner Filer. I am on the Los Angeles Board of the Jewish Federation. I'm also the incoming chair for UCLA Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. And I am thrilled that we are doing our community forum today on mental health and the impact of hate.
Thank you so much. And I'm not too sure if there's any other commissioners online. If there are, if they'd like to introduce themselves. Okay. I don't think there's anybody else online, so we're going to go ahead and go on. So next, I'll pass it over to Commissioner Filer to discuss the public comment process.
Okay, thank you. This commission is a public body, and an important part of being a public body is hearing from the public. To that end, this meeting is open to the public, and there will be opportunities for public comments throughout the meeting today. To keep an orderly meeting, please make sure to comment only on the agenda item under consideration. If you have comments that are not specifically related to an agenda item, please save your comment for the end during the agenda item titled Facilitated Public Comment and Discussion. To submit a written public comment by email the commission at csh@calcivilrights.ca.gov. I believe the email is in the chat. For everyone in the room today, you may also submit a written comment by writing your comment on the written public comment sheet located on the resource table and handing it to Rebecca. Rebecca, thank you for raising your hand. If you have a written comment that relates to an agenda item, we will read it out loud or summarize it when the public comment portion of that agenda item is open. If the comment is not about a specific agenda item, we will read it out loud or summarize it at the end of the meeting during the agenda item titled Facilitated Public Comment and Discussion. If you would like to speak at the meeting to deliver your public comment, you will have the opportunity to do so during the public comment portions of the meeting. At the end of an agenda item, we will ask if there is any public comment. We will begin with people in the room with us today, then move on to public comment on Zoom. For those who have joined us in the room today, you may request to speak on an agenda item in person by raising your hand during the public comment period, and someone will provide you a microphone to make your comment. If you are joining us on Zoom, you may request to speak on an agenda item by raising your hand virtually on Zoom. To do so on a computer, please raise your hand by pressing the raise hand button on the bottom of your screen. If you are on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing 9. In the interest of time, we will limit public comments to 3 minutes per person. Thank you. And I'm going to hand it back over to Commissioner Cuellar.
Thank you, Commissioner Feiler. So I'm going to go ahead and discuss the goals of the commission. The Commission on the State of Hate was established to strengthen California's efforts to stop hate and promote mutual respect among California's diverse population. And part of that mission and vision for the commission, we also have our forums, and where we want to hear directly from the public about their concerns and their issues that they're dealing with in the community. But also part of the forum is to bring resources and to really data that we can share with you guys, the community, on different topics. And today's topic will be the mental impacts on hate. So just kind of wanted to go over that with you and go over review the agenda today. So we have a really some great presenters today. So first, for our first agenda item number 2, informational presentation, hate as a risk for health in LGBT populations. Ian Meyer, PhD, Williams Distinguished Senior Scholar of Public Policy, the Williams Institute, UCLA School of Law. Agenda item number 3 is an informational presentation by Erica Bath, MD, Director of Child Forensic Services, Professor, Department of Psychiatry, Vice Chair of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Jane and Terry Seymour Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, UCLA. Agenda item number 4 is informational presentations on mental health resources. We'll have Eric Harris, Director of Public Policy, Disability Rights, California. And we'll have Trout Winters, Executive Director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness in the Greater Los Angeles County. And agenda number 5 is facilitated public comment and discussion. And then agenda item number 6 is adjournment. Okay. And now we'll be moving to agenda item number 2, informational presentations on the mental health impact of hate. Then the presenter is Dr. Ian Myers. Ian Myers, PhD, is the Williams Distinguished Senior Scholar for Public Policy at the Williams Institute and Professor Emeritus of Social Medical Sciences at Columbia University. In several highly cited papers, Meyer has developed a model of minority stress. The model has guided his and other investigators' population research on LGBT health disparities by identifying the processes by which social stressors impact health and describing the harm to LGBT people from prejudice and stigma. Myers is a principal investigator of the Generation Study, a U.S. national probability study of stress, identity, health, and healthcare utilization across 3 cohorts of sexual minorities and trans pop. The first national probability sample of transgender individuals in the U.S., Meyer received a PhD in social medical sciences from Columbia University. Thank you, Dr. Ian Myers.
Thank you, Commissioner Cuellar. I'm going to show my own slides. Can we move to that? Great. Please let me know if there's any problem. Sorry. Okay. Commissioner Roybal and distinguished members of the committee and members of the public, I am a distinguished senior scholar of public policy at the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law. The Williams Institute is dedicated to conducting research on sexual orientation and gender identity law and public policy. I'm a public health researcher. My area of expertise is the study of the effects of social stress related to prejudice and discrimination on the health of LGBTQ populations. In recent years, we have seen a resurgence of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and violence, including, sadly, in California, which we like to think is exempted from hate against LGBTQ people, but we were just recently reminded by the killing of clothing store owner Laura Ann Carlton, a straight cisgender mother of 9 in Lake Arrowhead, California, who was shot by a shooter who objected to a rainbow flag she displayed in her store. Last year, we witnessed the shooting of Club Q in Colorado, among many other events. And as I will show, violence against LGBTQ people is pervasive. Before I move to the topic of the presentation, just a couple of words on language. I think most people are familiar with these, but I wanted to highlight for members who might not are not as familiar with the topic. There's a difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. Many people confuse those, so I just meant to make this point. Sexual orientation refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and straight. Those are sexual orientation, whereas gender identity refer to transgender, gender non-binary, or cisgender people. There are other terms that I probably would not use here today. I do want to highlight the last term here, sexual minorities and gender minorities, which are terms that maybe are more familiar in academic circles, but they refer as well to sexual orientation and gender identity minorities, that is LGBTQ people. First, I want to also give you a very brief background on how many LGBT people are there in the United States. Most of the time when people try to guess, they overestimate by a huge percentage. And if you listen to the recent rhetoric and anti-transgender rhetoric in particular that's coming out from some state legislators and governors, you would think that it's a huge proportion of the US population. In fact, LGBT people are about 7% of the US population, with a higher percentage of people in younger age groups compared to older age groups. And transgender people, about 0.5% of the US population. A Williams Institute estimated about 1.3 million people in the entire United States. So really a small minority of people in the United States, again, with somewhat higher proportions in younger people. LGBT rights have seen significant developments and improvements in the past few decades, for sure, but homophobia and transphobia are embedded in American history and culture, and they produce stress, which I refer to as minority stress. This stress intersects with stigma and prejudice based on other statuses such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, etc. And so that different LGBTQ subgroups experience this social stress differently. But every LGBTQ person must learn to cope with stress related to stigma throughout their lives. In several recent studies, data collected by the Department of Justice as part of the National Crime Victimization Survey, my colleagues and I found that the odds of experiencing violent victimization defined as rape or sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated or simple assault were 4 times higher for LGBTQ than non-LGBTQ people. Assessing the victimization among transgender people as compared with cisgender people, specifically, we found that transgender people also had 4 times the rate of victimization as cisgender people. We also assessed the distribution of hate crimes, a subset of violent victimization, and found that LGBTQ people experience 8 times as many hate crimes as non-LGBTQ people. LGBTQ people are socialized, like many people in society, to believe that being LGBTQ is wrong and to believe in stereotypical and stigmatizing ideas such as that as an LGBTQ person, you will never find happiness and family who will love you. They often experience rejection and even violence by families of origin. In a national representative study, we found that 2/3 to 3/4 of LGBTQ people reporting having been bullied often or sometimes before they were 18 years old. This, of course, is not unique to youth. Almost half of transgender people and more than 1/3 of sexual minority cisgender men and women have been fired or denied a job at least once as adult. And as many as 43% of transgender people, 29% of gay, bisexual, queer men, and 25% of lesbian, bisexual, queer women had been denied a promotion or had received a negative evaluation. LGBTQ people of color are in particular reported experiences of verbal harassment in the workplace and being denied jobs. And many LGBTQ people reported experience of some form of everyday discrimination, which refers to being disrespected and insulted. In 1 year, 56 of transgender people, 48% of lesbian, bisexual, and queer cisgender women, and 34% of gay, bisexual, and queer cisgender men reported they were being treated with less respect than other people. So this is a common experience for LGBTQ people. Evidence shows that LGBTQ people are more likely to experience socioeconomic stress, including high rates of poverty, housing instability, and food insecurity. And specific subpopulations face even greater socioeconomic disparities, including transgender people, bisexuals, LGBTQ people of color, and older LGBTQ people. And I'd like to mention here that I'm showing general conclusions, but if you're interested in the specific studies, they're all posted on the website of the Williams Institute, and you're welcome to examine the research in greater detail. We hear a lot these days about social and legal changes that have taken place to improve the situation of LGBTQ people, which certainly has been the case if we think since the 1960s. In the generation study, my colleagues and I sought to assess how these changes in the law and other social aspects of life have changed the actual lived experience of young sexual minority people compared with older generation of sexual minority people. What we found was alarming, if not surprising. Younger people experience similar level of minority stresses related to stigma and prejudice as their older peers had experienced. More than 1 in 3 young people experience being hit, beaten, physically attacked, or sexually assaulted, and almost half had someone threaten them with violence, and almost 3/4 were verbally insulted or abused. So again, these are common experience for LGBTQ people, young and old. And despite the social changes that we have seen, those don't seem to be abated. I refer to the theory behind looking at the relationship between social environment and health as minority stress, which basically says that prejudice and stigma directed towards LGBT people bring about unique stressors, such as anti-gay violence, such as exclusion of transgender people from public bathrooms, and many of the other types of actions that we see taking place across the United States today. These stressors cause adverse health outcomes, including mental disorders. I've put this in a model that documents how stress leads to adverse health outcomes. Those include, by the way, both mental and physical health outcomes. But I would focus here today on the area that's called minority stress, which includes the prejudice events. Those are events such as hate crimes and violence against LGBTQ people. but also other types of experiences that are unique to LGBTQ people, such as internalized hatred, which is the result of being socialized in a society where homophobia and transphobia is embedded. I will come back to this model when I think about how we can help prevent some of those negative effects on LGBTQ health. In addition to the study of cisgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual people, the study of transgender minority stress included a focus on non-affirmation of gender identity. Affirmation refers to the interpersonal interactive process whereby a person receives social recognition and support for their gender identity and expression. So non-affirmation is the rejection of this type of support. And as I mentioned already, is something we see repeatedly and often these days coming out of Florida. This morning, I read in the news in the New York Times that Florida has established a new rule that would require firing of any person who works for the public institution who uses a public restroom that is not allowed for them to use, that is consistent with their sex assigned at birth. So not only are they not making bathrooms available to transgender people, they're now recommending that they'll be fired if they use a bathroom that is matching their gender. Because of this excess stress that LGBTQ people experience, sexual and gender minority people suffer the health consequences of this stress, including depression, anxiety, substance use, and suicide behavior. For example, younger cohort of sexual minority people in our study of different cohorts experienced the highest level of psychological distress, and 30% of the younger cohort compared with 20% of the oldest cohort of the sexual minority people reported a suicide attempt. As far as gender affirmation, research has showed that the prevalence of one-year suicide attempt by transgender individuals who reported that they had been denied equal treatment in the past year because they're transgender was more than double than those who had not experienced such treatment. That is, gender affirmation is a stressor that is itself related to mental health outcomes, as are some of the other stressors such as violence and discrimination. So I want to take a moment to talk about prevention and intervention. And one thing that this model does is point out to different areas where we can intervene and where we can think about different levels of interventions. And when I say levels of interventions, I mean everything ranging from the individual, such as providing sensitive and accessible mental health services, providing mental health prevention in schools, but also to the global social, legal, and policy arena, such as improving legislation and education, education of the public and in schools to provide to create a society that is less homophobic and transphobic. And I want to say that California does have the Fair Education Act, which is, I think, a very positive movement towards changing learned homophobia and transphobia. But as you all have seen in recent news articles from different school boards in California, there is a lot of rejection of the idea that school children should be educated to be tolerant and understanding of sexual and gender minorities. Thank you, and I'd be glad to receive any comments now. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer, for your presentation. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Commissioner Filer to initiate any public comment.
Okay, thank you. Again, some public comment reminders. You may request to speak on an agenda item by raising your hand on Zoom. If you are joining on a computer, you can raise your hand by pressing the raise hand button on the bottom of your screen. If you are on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing 9. And again, your comments should be pertinent to the presentation that was just provided to us. Do we have anyone in the room who would like to provide public comment at this time? If so, please raise your hand or hand your written comment to Rebecca. And again, reminder, it's a 3-minute limit. Anyone in the room? Okay. Oh.
Sir, do you want to come up and speak in the
get you a mic.
microphone? We're going to get you a mic
Yeah,
right over here. You can,
yeah, thank you.
sorry about that.
Thank you.
Take the occasion, people want to cause an intervention on purpose. So they're sort of terrorizing you. So, and like, for instance, like I'm like against the intervention, but people are trying to do it on purpose and it's not really working. So I had this case in the sheriff's department of getting my eye cut or whatever, or tagged at a bar because I'm a writer, so. And so what is there anything you can recommend when people are doing this on purpose to try to, and it's not really, it's sort of getting flubbed, I guess. Have any recommendations?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm trying to connect. Is this question related to the speaker that just presented on the presentation?
Oh, I don't know. It's about people trying to cause an intervention on purpose is all I'm saying.
Oh, okay. If it's
But it's
not-
like, I don't really want to, it's like they're not really succeeding in doing that because they're doing it on purpose.
maybe it sounds like, if I'm correct, maybe we want to save your question or comment to the end. Only because it's not related to the speaker who just presented. If that's okay, if you don't mind waiting till the end. Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments in the room for our related to the presentation that just happened? Okay, no written ones. So let me see, is there any on Zoom? Yes, okay. Thank you.
So Sunita, I'm going to unmute you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meyer. That was an excellent presentation. I wanted to ask, are there data on high school bullying? Because that is when bullying starts, at the middle school, at the high school. And have you seen a shift in perception over the past decade on children being more open to the LGBT community, to their transgender peers, et cetera?
Yes, thank you for the question. The data that I shared with you today was actually about youth. So this is adults that we asked them about experiences of bullying when they were under age 18, so when they were in high school. We have actually an interactive data set on the website of the Williams Institute that you can actually look at it for different populations. As I suggested before, there's a very, very high rates of bullying. In fact, when we wanted to report it, we asked people, was it often, sometimes, etc. And if we had reported about everybody who experienced bullying, we would have basically had everybody. So we had to report only on the more extreme ends of it. So bullying is a serious complaint and a serious occurrence. We have found, to address your second part of your question, I read a lot about a greater acceptance among young people. And that is definitely welcome. We do see even in public attitude data that there has been a positive change. But as I mentioned before, when we looked at the data of what people experience in their daily life, we're not seeing enough change to indicate a significant reduction in their level of exposure to bullying specifically, or other forms of violence and discrimination. So that is very concerning. I think that's why I mentioned that I think we need interventions on really different levels and different places. And I hate to say that, but even just changing laws is not enough. We've experienced people in our studies that reported about negative experiences in places of worship, in families, etc. And those are complicated issues, of course, but I think we need to have a complicated and multifaceted approach to intervention. Just waiting for the public attitudes to improve enough to remove all of this violence is not going to do it.
Are there any other comments on Zoom or questions? Okay, thank you. Do we have any written comments?
No written comments.
Okay, all right. Thank you, everyone, for the public comments. And again, just for anyone who's in the room or on line, we will have a period at the end for any additional public comments or questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Commissioner Cuellar at this point.
Thank you, Commissioner Feiler. And I'd like to take this time to introduce the next presentation and the presenter. The next presenter we have is Dr. Erica Bath. Dr. Bath is a professor and vice chair for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the Department of Psychiatry and senior advisor for the UCLA Anti-Racism Roadmap. Board certified in child and adolescent, adult, and forensic psychiatry. She has a longstanding interest in community mental health and has committed her career to advancing health equity for ethno-racial minoritized and structurally marginalized youth and families, with specialized focus on youth impacted by the foster care and juvenile legal system. She has dedicated her time to working with structurally vulnerable populations and consults regularly with the court system. Her portfolio of research has included funding from the National Institutes of Health and Los Angeles County Department of Probation. She teaches on structural racism and anti-racism and its impacts on mental health and biomedical research and workforce. Her current research involves using community participatory models to increase engagement in behavioral and reproductive health with health for girls with histories of commercial sexual exploitation and those involved in the child welfare and juvenile legal system. So thank you so much, Dr. Bath, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's a tremendous honor to be included in this forum. Can everyone see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And I also like to start with a land grant acknowledgement. I am coming to you from UCLA, and land acknowledgements are recognitions of truth and verbal memorials for those who speak and erect in the honor of Indigenous people. And so at UCLA, we are a public land grant institution and on the unceded ancestral territories of the Gabrielino and Tongva First Nation peoples. And so in paying respect to ancestors, elders, relatives, past, present, and emerging. I like to do something in my talks that's from the African tradition of call and response. And so I'm hoping you all will indulge me. And so feel free. I know there's people, it's a hybrid meeting. So there's some people in person and there's some people on Zoom, but I'm going to ask you for your attention, which is ago. And then you will respond as the audience, ame, meaning that you are listening. So let's try this. People feel free to unmute. Folks in the room, please respond. So I'm going to say ago, and you're going to say All right, thank you. And I think it's really important. We've been going since 10 a.m., right? And so I'm hoping to bring a little bit of levity to this very dense and really sort of just, this is a call of action for us right now. And in that, this notion of Sawubona, right? So this is a Zulu greeting, and it means that I see you. And it is really important, I think, in terms of setting frameworks and foundations that we're recognizing our interconnected humanity and seeing and each other, because that is going to be the sort of countervalence to combat hate. My disclosures, I have received funding as was presented in my introduction, but usually with any talk, I like to let you know, what sort of work I've been doing, what my funding sources have been, and that I really have no potential conflicts of interest, except I do like to anchor my positionality, right? And so this is a wheel that talks about intersecting axes of privilege, domination, and oppression. And there are many ways in which I come to this work with areas of privilege and also areas of marginalization. And so in revealing my true authentic self and giving you some context of what I'm bringing to the space, I like to reflect on my own positionality. So my pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as a Black, cisgender, heterosexual woman. I'm the granddaughter of a domestic worker and merchant seaman, an African descendant of enslavement with Caribbean roots. I'm a mom to a teen, daughter of Black physician activists. I've been working in predominantly white institutions and academia since 2003, but also in the juvenile legal and child welfare systems. I am an HBCU medical grad and an aspiring good trouble champion. And today it's really about getting in good trouble, necessary trouble. Setting some foundations and guiding principles. As we talk about mental health impacts of hate, I really am going to explore intersectionality, and I will define that later, but I want to explore the intersectionalism between forms of hate and violence. I'm going to spotlight racism, and in particular, white supremacy, which positions white heteronormativity and patriarchy as the most privileged pillars. And I will emphasize anti-Black racism, but will also underscore and amplify what all of the speakers have shared today, from the data that was shared to the speaker who just predated me, really focusing on structural bias and discrimination and structural violence, particularly that against LGBTQ populations. And so I want us to recognize that hate crimes, hate motivated behaviors are rooted in bias and discrimination and exist along a continuum. So there's different types of hate-based behavior, and I would put them all as some of the biggest public health threats of our time. A lot are also rooted in misinformation, which is another public health threat. So we think about violence, racism, discrimination, hate-based violence, hate-motivated behavior. It's really helpful to think about them as a series of concentric circles or even along a continuum, right? Because they are interrelated. And so this notion of intersectionality, where there's no such thing as a single issue struggle. Many of the data that was presented earlier showed the intersectional nature of some of these hate crimes, right? So the examples that we learned about today, even the most recent current events, right? Those show the sort of intersectional nature. So I'm going to highlight that. And terms that I will use and move through are hate crimes, hate motivated behavior, hate speech, racism, discrimination, and bias, and race-based violence. So these they're not necessarily interchangeable, but there is a considerable overlap in between. So, and I apologize that this slide is a little fuzzy. I hope that you can see it, but thinking about this sort of continuum, right? Victims of violence of hate are subject to a range of activities, right? And death being one of the most damaging and pernicious that we've just seen very recently. But hate crimes, hate speech, and discrimination a lot of these exist along a continuum. Discrimination and due to and structural bias really is prejudice that's really at the foundation of hate-based violence. So it results in the mistaken belief of othering, right? And this othering based on inferiority, presumed inferiority due to a certain assumed identity. Okay, hate speech is a common manifestation of discriminatory behavior, and it's often rooted and in discrimination and bias, but also demonstrated in various forms of media. And it includes, but not limited to, inciting others through verbal means to commit acts of violence against a vulnerable group. And hate crimes, for their quality of crime, are hopefully going to be penalized thanks to this commission. But we see that there's a lot of gaps in our legislative arm. So these are examples of manifestations of violence and structural violence. And I would say that our lack of comprehensive legislation, even thinking back to anti-lynching laws, was just recently passed, right, in 2022. It took years and years and decades. So trying to think about how to push us into really sort of thinking through legislative ways so that we dampen down these other pillars. Also, I really love this pyramid that highlights this sort of continuum between acts of bias, discrimination, bias motivated violence, and genocide. And so we are often in these pillars, like locally within the US, but this is a larger problem where we've seen various acts of genocide sort of globally. And so globally, there is a movement sort of thinking about hate and violence and thinking about it along this continuum. Really, so this pyramid of hate illustrates the prevalence of bias and hate and oppression in our society, and is organized on these escalating attitudes. And when bias becomes unchecked, it really becomes normalized and contributes to a pattern of escalating and accepting discrimination. This is my slide on intersectionality. I hope people are familiar with this term. This was coined by legal scholar and professor Kimberly Crenshaw. And it really refers to a lens or a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequity and inequality often operate together and exacerbate one another. And so many people, we're all intersectional in nature, right? We all have different and multiple identities and social positions. And so we tend to talk about issues as if they're delinked, but thinking about structural violence of hate crimes, it really reflects intersectionality, and those who are most structurally marginalized often have a multiplicity of intersectional identities. Hate motivated behavior is a public health threat. And it's not just, it's really the confluence, right, where structural, interpersonal, and individual antecedents and effects. And so as we think about solution building, there really is a need for interdisciplinary, multi-level research to better understand the causes of behavior and to test prevention strategies and interventions. So we've talked a little bit about this. I won't belabor this, but just to sort of anchor us again, in terms of hate crimes, it's really any offense that includes bias against another, and people carry them out to target another person's real or imagined race, origin, gender, sexual orientation, disability, religious belief. And we saw who are the most victimized, but recognize the intersectional nature of who receives the most victimization. And hate crimes come in various forms. And so we see, speech during, before, and after the act. We see symbols, damages to property, and unfortunately, murders. What is a hate motivated behavior? Well, verbal or non-verbal expressions of discrimination. And then we also see intentional acts of hate. Thinking about hate-based violence, it's a type of traumatic stressor intended to instill fear and anxiety, inflict psychological damage, diminish a sense of belonging, and exclude a group identified as other. And so at the core of hate-based violence is this notion of discrimination, which is why I'm going to talk a little bit with you about some of the literature on racism and the negative effects of health. But the harms of hate-based violence really extend beyond the person being victimized and harmed, right? So there's a larger negative community effect that is the impact. And so we really sort of need to think broadly, and this is why I'm sort of pushing our call to action to include public health responses, is really the negative community effects of hate-based violence. Hate-based violence may include a continuum of behaviors, right? And so we think about some of the assaults to well-being, and this can constitute traumatic events in accordance with DSM-PTSD criteria. And these really represent significant stressors that may be represented by other diagnoses. And so the traumatic impact of hate-based violence is often broad. The social consequences are very complex and really can impact population health across generations, right? So this notion of the multi-generational and even epigenetic effects of these harms are quite compelling. And thinking about the violence and the manifestations of violence, right, that are across this continuum from hate crimes to hate speech and discrimination. Now, thinking about just zooming out, what we saw in our data are Blacks, ethno-racially and sexual gender minoritized people are disproportionately impacted by hate crimes. And we've seen the data where these crimes are increasing, they're more pervasive. I was actually shocked to see how California was leading in a lot of areas as a state, because at the same time we are among the most, I would think, open, we are also experiencing a lot of harm. And really thinking about anti-Black racism as one of the main drivers. So I would like to sort of highlight some of the negative effects of racism, which again, if we're thinking about health effects, thinking about racism as one of these sort of core elements of hate and hate-based violence, this will hopefully make sense to you. And so we think about structural barriers that overlap with race, right? We have transphobia, homophobia, ableism, sexism, xenophobia, right? And all of these sort of interact, and there's intersectionality between them, right? And we think about these structural determinants of health. People who are in these oppressed categories, right, are going to have negative health outcomes, right? So this is where the sort of structural nature of our society exacerbates and comes down hardest on those who are most structurally marginalized and structurally vulnerable. And so there's negative health effects, right? And these are all exacerbated by the violence that is upon these different groups. I also want to highlight, in terms of thinking about public health crises, and we've already sort of shown how violence is a public health crisis, hate-based violence, but racism as well, right? And so there is a lot of overlap. This slide is a little bit old in terms of the update, but several jurisdictions nationally have been underscoring that racism is a public health crisis, and that we really need to sort of move towards addressing it. And it's public health because of all the negative health effects. And this is not just sort of different jurisdictions, legislative efforts, but also most of our major medical organizations, ranging from the American Medical Association to the National Institutes of Health. And really, this extends to not only thinking about violence of police contact, but also just individuals perpetrating harms on each other. And then this is really, thinking about the timeline of systemic racism. This has been going on for centuries. And within this nexus, right, discriminatory bias against other marginalized groups are included. I want to highlight a couple of things that people may not realize. And so when there's harms and violence to groups based on their personal and social identities, there is harms to the community. So one thing that people may not realize is that there's a group of scholars who are actually looking at lynching and tying it to mortality today. And so they found that in communities that had higher rates of lynching in 1877 to 1950, that actually showed higher mortality rates between 2010 to 2014. And so we've been talking about kind of the negative health effects of violence, but lynching is a form of racialized and also, you know, sexual gender minority people were lynched, people who have disabilities were lynched. So thinking about lynching and violence and also recognizing that the negative health effects can persist for decades well after the incident takes place. Also, this recent work with David Williams and his research group really sort of highlighted how unjust police killings damage the mental health of Black Americans, but not just Black Americans. Now, we know that 1 out of every 1,000 Black boys or men can expect to be harmed by police in their lifetime, which is a crazy statistic, but understanding that the harm isn't just to those individuals, right, or their families, but that there's a population effect. And so what they sought to do was to identify if police killings of civilians had negative effects, not just on the victim's family, immediate relatives and friends, but on the larger community. And they looked at every police shooting in America over a 3-year period between 2013 and 2015. And then they linked that with data from the Centers for Disease Control on the mental health of the population in every state. And what they found was every police shooting of an unarmed Black person was linked to worse mental health for the entire Black population in that state where that shooting occurred for the next 3 months, okay? And it wasn't just every police shooting that did that. It was if the Black person was armed, there wasn't a negative effect on Black mental health, but it was the unarmed. And so this notion of unfairness, of vulnerability, right? And vulnerability of populations. And so it was really a striking finding because no one had ever sort of looked at things in that way. And this notion of the broader threat to community well-being, right? And the mental health consequences is really telling. So if we think about the mental health consequences of hate crimes, right? Besides the physical threats that hate crimes cause, these events also produce other harmful long-term outcomes. So over time, there's economic, educational, housing inequities for all of the people targeted in that group. And they can get worse, you know, like previous trauma sensitizes. So people who have multiple intersectional identities who are in more oppressed groups often have pre-existing trauma, right? And so that can exacerbate, be exacerbated when there's harms. And so after a hate crime, you know, which leads to emotional damage, people may lose trust in any person who is part of the offender's group, right? They may feel targeted, ashamed, and scared that they'll be hurt again. This sort of notion of misattributional thinking, heightened response and reactivity to perceived threat. They may deny the part of their identity that the hate time targeted. They may stop certain activities that they once enjoyed because they no longer feel safe. And so even if a hate crime didn't happen to someone specifically, cases that affect members of your own social, ethnic identity can impact your well-being, and entire communities suffer. And so we really need to have a community response. One recent paper that just came out was looking at LGBTQ hate crimes and suicidality among sectional minority adolescents. And really, there's not enough time in this talk to talk about every single group and all the different types of negative effects that hate crimes have on their well-being, but you can just accept or trust as a framework that, yes, the crimes are harmful. They have negative mental health sequelae, from suicidality to depression to anxiety, and it's a group effect. And so this study actually looked at hate crimes of LGBTQ related hate crimes involving assault and battery between 2005 and 2008 from the Boston Police Department. And they showed that sexual minority youth residing in these neighborhoods with higher rates of hate crimes on LGBTQ populations were significantly more likely to report suicide ideation and suicide attempts. And that finding is, staggering, horrific, because LGBTQ youth have among the highest suicide rates of adolescent populations. They are incredibly vulnerable. So just besides, and they're, structurally vulnerable because of our heteronormative, anti-affirming society that we live in, but that hate crimes are another lever in pushing their mental health outcomes. Other mental health consequences of hate crimes include anxiety and depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. So there are various studies that look at this across groups, but really the experts have also found that PTSD may arise after events that don't usually match PTSD diagnosis guidelines, such as depression. So groups that receive the sort of constant onslaught of oppression and hate crime activity may be more at risk for PTSD. We just talked about suicidal behavior, but it's not limited just to LGBTQ youth. Drug use is also a negative effect of experiencing hate crimes, as well as emotional suppression, which is really an unhealthy way to cope. And so sometimes it's safer to suppress feelings. And so people who are dealing with constant oppression may hide their emotions. Now, racism, really, this is a great paper. It's a systematic review and a meta-analysis, but they looked at several different studies, right, to really understand the health impacts of racism, right, which is along that continuum. And it was found that racism was associated with poor mental health, including depression, anxiety, and also poor general physical health, right? And so it's important to recognize the nexus between negative mental health, negative physical health. And in this meta-analysis, they actually found that these links were even strongest for Asian American and Latino populations compared to African American populations. So it is negative across the board for multiple people. And so some of the key take homes is really recognizing that hate-based violence is a potentially traumatic stressor, right? It differs really categorically from other types of traumatic events because it really has a negative community effect, and that it can impact well-being. And really research suggests that we need to ramp up our efforts to really understanding our data capture, right? Because of the frequency and prevalence of hate-based violence, and really remove barriers to accessing treatment and care for survivors, and also increasing the ability for people to actually report, for creating the sense of safety. I did want to just talk a little bit about trauma's impact on brain development, because, beyond someone sort of feeling depressed or anxious or having PTSD, there's also just this trauma, right, on, especially if we think about youth, right, and children are our future, how these harms really actually shift brain development. And so in typical development, you're spending most of your time, right, in this sort of higher level functioning of cognition, right? But when you've had a lot of trauma, that triangle is inverted and you're really sort of functioning, and this is sort of what we call the reptilian brain, where you're in survival mode. And that is exhausting. It's bad for your health. It increases cortisol and other neurochemicals that advance biological age. And so I don't know if people are familiar with the concept of weathering, but this is some important work by Arlene Geronimus, who talks about the sort of early health deterioration as a consequence, right, of the cumulative impact of repeated social, economic adversity and political marginalization. And so actually not only are people having, sort of worse mental health, but their cells are more aged, right? And that is just really, shocking. So numerous studies show that with this weathering hypothesis, that Black Americans are really thought to be, on average 7.5 to 10 years older compared to their white counterparts because of this weathering phenomenon. And so allostatic load is another sort of concept I want people to recognize that are sort of increased allostatic load rather as a result of like the harms of hate. And so this cumulative index of multi-biological aging, again, having stress as normal in our body is adapted to respond to stress, but the stress response, the stress overload of constantly being stressed, of the hypervigilance, right? This sort of makes our body systems out of whack, or we're constantly in adaptation mode. So we're functioning in this survival zone. So people who, and groups, social groups who experience more targeted hate-based violence are ending up having more time spent there, which increases their biological aging. So really faced with a threat, the body normally produces hormones and other signals that are responsive to that. But when the threat becomes pervasive, reoccurring, which is the case with police brutality or the type of violence, right? This causes wear and tear on body organs. So what are we gonna do? Well, I really like this quote by Nelson Mandela that talks about in order to counter hatred, intolerance, and indifference, we need to work both individually and at structural levels, which is why we are here. And that these efforts must be reinforced by our efforts to create structures in society to support the ongoing negotiations in the human community. So people talked about community engaged and centered activities. And also I would add to that community-based participatory research. Some recommendations also include sort of thinking through the different systems and structures that we have, right? So schools, law enforcement, public health programming, psychological strategies. So these and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but recognizing that interventions need to be multi-sectoral and data-driven. I'm going to just highlight this social ecological model because individuals are nested within societies, right, with their own interpersonal relationship within communities. And so we need to think about cross-cutting interventions that use a public health approach. So what is the problem? We don't have an accurate scope of knowledge, right? Because so many crimes are underreported, right? How can we identify protective and risk factors, right? What are the different ways that we're going to implement prevention strategies, and how can we ensure widespread adoption? Okay. I'm going to end with a couple of hopefully hopeful messages. I don't know if people are familiar with the work of Valerie Carr, but she has piloted something called the Revolutionary Love Project. And her uncle was Sikh and murdered after 9/11. And she went from working as a lawyer in civil rights to really sort of channeling that to really encourage people to focus on love as a way to mitigate hate and harms. And she really sort of encouraged people to embrace this notion of revolutionary love as a choice to labor for others, our opponents, and ourselves. And I think that that's one of the calling that we're here today. And she really sort of feels like this is one of the calls of our time. And so she thinks about this as sort of seeing no stranger, right? Tending the wound and breathe and push. And so it really thinks about focusing on others, opponents, right? So these are the non-allies and ourselves and the work to do that. And really this, even though Carr's work is somewhat recent, it's not totally new. And so this notion of Sankofa, where we think about our past and we retrieve it to bring those lessons forward, the work of Dr. Martin Luther King really highlighted, you know, when I was preparing for this talk, I was looking at different civil rights leaders and how they thought and conceptualized antidotes to hate, and it was love, right? And so only love can be the sort of bludgeon that eliminates hate. And this is also reiterated by Gandhi, also by Nelson Mandela, right? People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Cesar Chavez as well. And of course, Maya Angelou as part of my outro. So hate It has caused a lot of problems in the world, but has not solved one yet. I'd like to end with a haiku that I wrote for Laura Carlton and O'Shea Sibley. And I don't know if people are familiar with the structure of haiku, but it's 7 syllables for the first line, 5 for the second, and 7 for the last. So hate is cruel, robs us daily, kills joy and justice. Love heals, transforms. Love will win. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bath, for that very eye-opening presentation. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Commissioner Filer for any public comments.
Okay, thank you once again. That was really an excellent presentation. So public comment reminders, you may request to speak on an agenda item by raising your hand on Zoom. If you are joining on a computer, you can raise your hand by pressing the raise hand button on the bottom of your screen. If you are on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Also, the comments should be related to the presentation that was just made. And let's start with anyone in the room who would like to make a public comment. No one in the room. Were there any written comments handed to you, Rebecca? Okay. All right. So right now, I guess we're going to move over to, is it you, Monica? No. Yes, on Zoom.
Yes, we have 2 folks. So first up is Sunita. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and then you can talk.
Thank you, Dr. Bath. That was an excellent presentation. I wanted to ask you about the underreporting of hate crimes. As you know, there is underreporting due to stigma and also a distrust of law enforcement in many of the communities that we both work in. Could you address that? And also the inability of law enforcement to actually prosecute hate crimes, given the very structured approach that we have to identifying what a hate crime is.
I wonder if I'm the best person to answer this question. I'll try. Thank you so much for your feedback. And I mean, as a physician and a mental health professional, I would say, what I try to do and leaning into and the sort of approaches, I recognize the need to leverage my own positionality to work outside of just in the clinical domain, right? So to the extent that I can be present at talks like these, work on policy related activities to address stigma, that's, I think, one of the callings, but I do think it's a sort of a broader response, and hopefully that can be sort of tackled on the agenda, right? Is like how to cultivate a sense of belonging so that people feel empowered to report, and that we decrease the stigma where the aggressors don't have the sort of the privileged positionality, right, to not only do the crime, but just to squash the ability and voice of people to, report any other types of crime that may happen. I mean, I think that that's really one of the challenges. And I think really working with communities, engaging communities in that response and sort of publicly highlighting that, and maybe perhaps pairing when there are harms in a particular community, like was in San Bernardino just the other day, how can we sort of center community activists with legislators and being on this, sharing space in terms of addressing the harm. So.
Thank you.
Oh, we have is this a question or comment related to the presentation?
Is it not working?
Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. sir.
Yeah.
Here's what I really wanted to say, and I think it's more relevant to reporting the hate crimes is because people try to cause the interventions as a joke constantly, and you don't want the interventions anymore. So it's a problem of reporting it because you kind of want to avoid all the intervention. So I think that's a little more trying to be relevant to what thank you.
Okay, thank you.
There's one more.
Yes, was there another question, comment on Zoom?
Yes, so Sean Gilbert, I'll go ahead and unmute you now.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, both to Professor Meyer and to Dr. Bath. I can't tell you how many notes I took during your presentation. Professor Bath, so many wonderful comments you made, and it was just, oh gosh, so inclusive of many different cultures. So I thank you. And you sort of have validated some thoughts, because I live in Antioch in the Contra Costa County area. And we're going through, I think, some mental health because of the issues with our police department. I'm a white woman, privileged, but the people in my community are hurting. And I'm sure you've seen it. It's been on National Public Radio for, but yeah, it does affect the entire community, but especially those who are our targeted community members. So thank you for validating my thoughts on this.
Thank you so much for sharing, and and for being here and being, an ally.
Another Zoom comment?
We have one more.
Okay.
So Sarat, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. That was a great conversation, Dr. Bad, that you just organized. I have two questions. Coming from a research background and now working in civic engagement and policy, I am interested in your two concepts that you talked about, intersectionality and weathering. And I was wondering, how does intersectionality and weathering data might come to be, and how might that differ for different minority communities?
So when you say, how does intersectionality come to be, can you clarify? And maybe I can just offer this explanation again, where intersectionality really refers to the confluence of social and personal identities, right? So I am a Black cisgender female, right? So those are some of my personal identities. I might experience oppression as a woman, right? As a Black person, but as a Black woman, some of the harms that I might experience are amplified by my different social personal identities that are particularly less privileged than others, right? So does that sort of answer your question? So thinking of intersectionally, we would think about our, various identities, and back to that wheel of power and privilege, right? There are many ways in which I have a lot of privilege identities, being a physician, being a professor in academic medicine, right? At UCLA, all those different ways confer privilege, but there are different ways in which I experience oppression. And all of that is balled up into one person, right? So that really refers to the intersectionalism, that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, which is what Audre Lorde said, because we don't, right? Many of us have ways in which, and some of our personal and social identifiers that might be marginalized, some of those are hidden, you know, or not as visible to others.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just have one more question if I can go still. So this presentation I think is going to be super helpful for not just people who are here, but for everybody in the community. So I was wondering, like, how can organizations like extend this data that you just offered like to the community? So basically like going from this forum and then dispersing it to the people that we serve.
I mean, I'm happy to be invited to give a talk, or I don't know. I mean, and there are many scholars who, you know, a lot of this work is not my own, you know, so like Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionalism, or the work of David Williams, who's a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health. I mean, so some of these work are out there, but yes, I think sort of how do we bridge gaps, right, between people who are doing the research or conceptualizing the research, and particularly health professionals, and being in spaces where they can disseminate that. And I would sort of vote or, you know, argue for a co-sharing mechanism, because sure, I might be, you know, privy to these peer-reviewed publications, et cetera, but I think also people with lived experience need to be telling the story as well. And to whatever extent that we can create spaces to not only highlight the harms, but also to co-create collaborative solutions, right, together. So it's not just like academics coming and giving their, you know, 2 cents without it being anchored in the reality of people's lives who are living and most impacted by them. So the disability rights has a for us, by us. And so it really needs to be, any solution building needs to be around that. But I'm happy to also disseminate all of this.
And also I want to mention to the person who just zoomed in the question, this is also being taped and you can access this and provide it to your community members as well, because I agree, the more we can share your presentation that you just did, it would be terrific. Are there any other Zoom questions or comments?
Yes, there's one more.
Okay.
Connie Alexandra, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Bath, so much. Connie Alexander, president of the Santa Barbara chapter of the NAACP. So appreciative of this, of your whole position here. And I'm wondering if you can give some thoughts around here. We have really racial trauma that happens to especially our youth. Then we have very high expulsion rates of our Black youth. And it feels like it continues that cycle, like our kids are caught in this cycle. And I'm just wondering if you can't speak to that or if you have some thoughts on that. And then I will say, consider yourself invited to Santa Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Connie. Yes, I mean, I am a child, adolescent, and forensic psychiatrist. So I actually work primarily with youth who are in the juvenile legal system and the child welfare system. I've been the consulting psychiatrist to LA County's juvenile mental health court since 2007. And so thinking about school to prison pipeline and all the ways in which to disrupt it are paramount to me. And exclusionary discipline, which is expulsion, suspensions, are one of the biggest structural drivers of that phenomenon. And many times, sadly, youth who are in under-resourced neighborhoods, right, and who tend to be ethno-racially minoritized Black and Brown youth have less access to rehabilitative services. So youth who have learning disabilities and mental health conditions, their school districts, because they're under-resourced, aren't able to meet those needs. And so they're disproportionately getting shunted to the juvenile legal system. Also, school districts that have a high prevalence or any presence of school resource officers, right? Like law enforcement doesn't really belong in school. And when you have law enforcement in school, I mean, this is a touchy subject, but the default is utilizing them, right, to deal with problem solving. And so you do see just sort of this portal to the legal system for youth where there's high prevalence, right? And so there's a lot of ways in which we can talk and tackle about this. And it really starts as early as preschool. So some of the things that recommendations, right, are sort of how do we educate educators to actually have a gaze of inclusivity, of empathy towards Black and Brown children and not penalize their behavior. So we see this phenomenon resulting in differential diagnoses gaps, right? So there's an ADHD gap for Black and white children, for Latino and white children. That's huge. And right. And you see that starting as early as, elementary school, and that ends up costing lives, right? It ends up resulting in more contact time for those Black and Latino youth, increasing their risk to go into the juvenile legal system. Because if their behaviors are not contextualized with empathy and under a therapeutic lens, and they're just seen as being bad, right, as opposed to having ADHD, which is treatable, then that, therein lies the rub, right? So the school to prison pipeline is really a critical, avenue, right? And it's the biased gaze of system actors like teachers that unfortunately impact how behaviors are perceived and which kids are referred to what type of disciplinary action.
I'm going to move us forward just because of the time. Any more on Zoom or, okay. So Monica, do we have any other?
No written public comment.
Okay. We're going to move to our next presenter. I'm going to turn it back over to Commissioner Cuellar.
Thank you, Commissioner Filer, and thank you so much, Dr. Bath, and everybody for those comments and questions. Before we go to the next presentation, I'd like to just kind of open it up and for the commissioners to see if they had any questions. I didn't do that in the previous presentation. So if there's any, Commissioner Levin.
What marvelous presentations. This is exactly what we had in mind when we wanted to bring experts into the public forum. Boy, thank both of you. So here's my question, because I get asked this a lot. With respect to empathy, not structurally so, but someone who's not a commissioner, for instance, or something. But what can we do as just individuals when someone who is a student, family member, friend, or coworker and belongs to some kind of vulnerable minority group and comes to us, what's the best way that we can demonstrate support and empathy just on that personal level? And I'm just so thrilled to be able to ask like a UCLA academic psychiatrist this question. This is wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, I don't think.
Or maybe not.
No, I'm back. I mean, how do we cultivate empathy? I think is centering the margins, to quote Bell Hooks's work, right? So start with those who are most marginalized and center them, their experiences, their perspectives, their needs, their wants in the solution building. Rarely do our legislative rooms, right, reflect those who are most structurally vulnerable. They're often not at the decision-making table. And so I think that needs to be inversed and overpopulated with those who are most impacted. And I think just this sort of, revolutionary radical love framework, right? That's also something that's been for some anti-racism scholars, the love framework has also been highlighted. And so how can we sort of A, center the margins, B, think about sort of inclusive, sort of white heteronormative ways of, sort of classifying people. So it's really also disrupting white supremacy culture in some areas and allowing the multiplicity of our communities and our identities to be the center dominant theme.
But at an individual level, like for instance, a student came into me once and told me how their parents disowned them because they were gay. Oh, how can we demonstrate that? And of course, that was a teacher-student thing, but just on an interpersonal as opposed to like a commission or legislative interaction. What would you suggest?
How you mean in terms of how the teacher would respond, or
the teacher, the family member? In other words, not someone coming from an institutional framework necessarily, but from a more personal aspect, a friend or a family member, coworker, that kind of thing.
I mean, creating safe haven, right? That is one of the sort of challenges and reasons why LGBTQ youth in particular have such high suicide rates, as well as high carceral entanglements, right? So in the juvenile legal system, they're overrepresented, and particularly BIPOC LGBTQ youth, because of their loving and desires are unfortunately criminalized, and they're also at risk for being kicked out of their homes. And so how do we create just a more empathic, I think so many things, I don't think you're going to get away from societal level responses, because that, like, individuals are nested in societies, and those societies create dominant or more inclusive cultures, which then can impact individuals. So, but there are many things that school districts can do: education, anti-bullying campaigns, having more representative staff, making it safe for people who do identify as sexual gender minority to be out, and creating affinity spaces within those groups, educating and normalizing and destigmatizing mental health. So I think that there's a lot of different levers, but they need to be pulled at all those sort of levels. So policy, community, interpersonally.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bath. Thank you so much for that. With that, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next presentation. And that is going to be the impact of hate on the disability community. Presenter will be Eric Harris, Director of the Public Policy, Disability Rights, California. Public Policy Director with an extensive career working closely with disability leaders, community members, and elected officials throughout the country to progress change for the disability community. Harris brings significant political, federal, and state policy experience, having worked for Congressman Barbara Lee, the Democratic National Committee, and the NAACP of California. He started his time at DRC over 4 years ago, working in legislation and strategic partnerships and community engagement. He is a member of the State Independent Living Council as a Governor Newsom appointee, and a board member of the Resources for Independent Living in Sacramento. He grew up in Sacramento, California, and was an elite wheelchair basketball player. So I'd like to now welcome Eric Harris on the impact of hate on the disability community. I would like to note, though, there will be no PowerPoint presentation to accompany this presentation. While Mr. Harris is presenting, we'll use a slide with his name, job title, and title of the presentation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be here with everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Eric Harris. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Director of Public Policy at Disability Rights California, and I'm based in Sacramento. And it's wonderful to know that there are so many friends and colleagues who are a part of this work. Seeing many of you there in person, and then I've seen several on the Zoom as well. So I know I'm in good company, in a good space because of all the folks who I recognize. So I want to get started, and I really appreciate that background. I just want to mention, so I was born with a physical disability. I have lived with my disability my entire life, and I've used a wheelchair for most of that time. Starting off, I grew up in a family of advocates, both in the policy and law space. My father is a professor and an attorney, and my mother is a teacher. Both are on the faculty at the University of California at Merced. And so I grew up in a family of educators, policy advocates, lawyers, and it's really had a major impact on how I view all of these issues. But most of all, the impact of my own lived experience of having a disability and being an African American, living in society, that has had the biggest impact on me as an individual and how I view all of these different issues. So I just wanted to give that as a little bit of context for myself. Disability Rights California. So for anybody who might not know, Disability Rights California is a statewide nonprofit protection and advocacy organization. And what we do is we advocate on behalf of all people with disabilities and provide free legal services for them throughout the state of California. In that work, we have a number of advocates. We have over 100 lawyers within our organization. We have over 300 total staff, 26 offices throughout the state, from the southern border in San Diego all the way up to the far northern region of the state. And these offices provide resources and access and information for all people with disabilities and their loved ones to make sure that they know what their rights are and that we have the ability to support them and advocate on behalf of the disability community. Also within, and I know previously the previous speaker was speaking about mental health, and that's a really important issue. And I want to make sure I cover pieces of mental health advocacy and hate crimes and hate incidents that impact their community. But of course, Disability Rights California and my work is broad and covers not only mental health, but other disabilities as well. As a part of our work, we have a peer self-advocacy unit within our organization, and the peer self-advocacy unit focuses on mental health peers and supporting people with lived experience with mental health disabilities. They do a lot of great work on the ground in the community, reaching out to people who have mental health disabilities and other diagnoses. And in that work, we do our best to connect with colleagues in the mental health peer space. Several mental health peer-run organizations in the state include Cal Voices, one of the older mental health peer-run organizations. One of their main offices is in Sacramento. CAMPRO, which is the California Mental Health peer-run organization. It's a group of mental health peer-run organizations, and there are plenty of others, and many have actually started more recently, or at least have gotten much more recognition in recent years because of all of the issues that many folks with mental health disabilities have had to navigate over the last 5 to 10 years, and at least have gotten a lot more attention doing it. So that's one space that I want us to get started. And I don't know, I don't see the slides up anymore, but are there still those slides, or should I just keep going?
Slides I just did a stop share. So the slide is up in the room. And so we just had the one cover slide of you, Mr. Harris.
Okay, okay, sounds good. So there's still, so I can go ahead and mention next slide and you guys will be able to do that.
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So on the next slide after the intro, I just put some disability data, and the interesting thing about disability data, and I'm sure it's similar to many forms of data, but especially on disability, it's very difficult to know for sure and to have really concrete exact numbers. There have been a lot of different numbers that have been thrown out there when it comes to the number of people living with a disability in the state of California and really throughout the country. Some of the estimates that are out there and some of the estimates that are used by professionals, including at the CDE and other spaces, has been an estimate of about 1 in 4 people in the state of California have some form of disability. And that number can range. It's 1 in 4, but up to 1 in 3. And even that, I would say, is only an estimate. And there are a number of reasons for that, of course. People with disabilities are often undercounted for being misdiagnosed. A lot of people, especially who come from different communities, might not have the level of access, resources, medical care, et cetera, to be properly diagnosed. So that's one major issue and a reason for the undercount, one part of the undercounting. Another is that a lot of people who might have disabilities might not either want to acknowledge that they have a disability or choose not to disclose that they have a disability, choose not to go down the path of asking for resources. And there are, of course, a number of reasons for that. We all acknowledge that stigma in any form of disability is prevalent throughout society. In the space of mental health, of course, it is where there is a lot of stigma, but there are still folks with stigma in a lot of other places as well. So that's a really important piece to keep in mind when looking at the numbers. Next slide, please. Hate crimes against disabled people. Much of the data shows that disabled people are more often victims of hate crimes and hate incidents, and especially when you consider people with disabilities that intersect with other races and ethnicities, and people who are in the LGBTQIA+ communities. When those people also have disabilities, they're very often going to be the victims of violence, the victims of hate crimes, and it's really unfortunate that high on that list are disabled women and disabled Black women, especially. When you look at the worst kind of information when it comes to the data, and the most often victims of these incidents, Black women with disabilities are at the highest levels of the data. And the number seems to, of course, increases the more underrepresented groups that the individual happens to be a part of. Next slide, please. Why are disabled people often victims? So just as a quick overview, disabled people are often part of multiple marginalized groups, as I mentioned earlier. Often disabled people are people who are unhoused or under circumstances that make it very difficult. And so when they're part of all these different groups and often unhoused or poor, they are more often going to be in situations where they can be victimized. And of course, we talked earlier about the history, childhood, bullying, of course, in elementary school, middle school, and high school, all the way through, that there is a sense of otherisms with people with disabilities. And I know I'm short on time, so I'll quickly ask for the next slide, please. And I know this was mentioned earlier, and I'll just quickly mention that disabled people who are the victims of hate crimes very often experience mental health crises, trauma, additional forms of mental health abuse that can last with folks throughout their lives. And of course, PTSD is a form of that, and people can live with PTSD or other forms of trauma throughout their lives. And sometimes the outward form of this PTSD can be anger or shame, and other reactions that can appear dangerous or can appear scary to people who are not experts in the space. And I know I just have maybe 1 or 2 slides left. So if we can go to the next one. What can we do? I mentioned earlier some of the peer-run organizations, and that isn't only the case for mental health peers, but also folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, family groups, people with physical disabilities. There are independent living centers in almost every major city throughout the state of California. These are all safe spaces for people with disabilities to be able to go, communicate, and find a sense of community. And I found that has been really, really helpful for folks with disabilities, especially people who are newly disabled, people who have gotten injured, or people who've developed a disability later in life. And I think I only have 1 slide left. So just a reminder, Disability Rights California, we're a large protection and advocacy organization. I put the website and our intake line phone number on here as well. We want to be a resource to people who are experiencing challenges. Maybe it's access to resources, maybe it's access to community, but we want to be available for folks. We have offices throughout the state. Our biggest offices are in Sacramento, Oakland, Los Angeles, and San Diego, and I encourage folks to reach out. So thank you so much. I know I went a little long, but I really appreciate the time today.
Yeah, no worries, Mr. Harris. No worries about that. Thank you so much for your presentation. And we'll go ahead and take public comment after the next presentation. So I'd like to introduce NAMI 101 Mental Health Resources. The presenter we have is Trouty Winters, Executive Director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Greater Los Angeles County. Trouty Winters is Executive Director of NAMI, Greater Los Angeles County, which is a leading county-wide organization composed of grassroots-based chapters that promotes wellness, recovery, equality, and dignity for individuals and families affected by mental illness and the community at large. She provides leadership and advocacy, education, support, and public awareness throughout the Los Angeles County. Prior to joining NAMI in 2021, Trouty was a Greater Los Angeles and Central Coast Area Director for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention for 6 years, overseen from San Luis Obispo to the Los Angeles County. As Area Director, she worked with communities on educational programs, advocated for public policy, and provided programs and resources that supported those affected by suicide. She has over 15 years of nonprofit experience working with large national nonprofits in education and outreach, advocacy, events, and fundraising. Trouty started her career in marketing and advertising before moving into nonprofit work. I'd like to welcome Trouty Winters. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I know we're short on time, so I'll try to be as quick as possible if you don't mind the next slide. You can go to the next slide. So the National Alliance on Mental Illness is the nation's largest grassroots mental health nonprofit. We have over 600 affiliates across the country. And here in California, we have over 50 affiliates. So we're pretty much in every community. We are a peer-run organization, and our members include families, friends, and people living with any type of mental illness. Next slide. So I'm here to provide resources. What would you do if a loved one was diagnosed with a mental illness? Well, NAMI's here to connect people and to offer hope and help in every step of the way of a family member's, a caregiver's, or an individual or community's interaction with mental illness. Next slide. So what we do is we offer confidential, no-cost support groups, both for individuals who live with a mental health condition, as well as for family members and caregivers. So Connections is a peer-led support group for anyone who lives with a mental health condition. It's run by highly trained folks who live with a mental health condition. And the same thing for a family support group. It is led by a trained adult with a loved one who lives with a mental health condition. We also have helplines and warm lines throughout the state that anyone can call to get resources and to be connected with any of our programs. All of our affiliates also have speaker nights. For example, Ask the Psychiatrist, provide local resources, the latest in mental health treatment. We do a lot of training and presentations with law enforcement, working with companies, anyone who is interested in receiving information on our mental health programs. Next, please. So Family to Family, a couple of our major programs. It's also available in Spanish. We have programs in other languages as well, but Family to Family is a good first step for any family who has anyone diagnosed with a mental health condition. And it's an 8-week class, and it really teaches people about how to understand different mental health conditions. It increases coping skills and really empowers individuals. And self-care is a big part of that, because anyone who knows who supports someone with a mental health condition, it can be very difficult. So self-care is very important. And then Basics is a similar class, but it's for parents and guardians of a youth age 22 or younger who lives with a mental health condition. Next slide. And NAMI Peer-to-Peer is a program for adults who live with a mental illness. So it's for people who are looking to better understand their condition as well as their journey to recovery. So again, it's led by peers who've been there, and it includes presentations, discussions, interactive exercises, and all of our programs are confidential. We don't support any specific treatment, but we do offer many resources. Next, please. In Our Own Voice is a public education program. So this is designed to help reduce the stigma. We want people to understand from someone who lives with a mental illness what it's like to live with a mental illness and how they've achieved recovery. Ending the Silence is a program for middle and high school students, as well as school staff and parents, and it teaches the audience to learn about the signs and symptoms of a mental health condition, how to recognize the early warning signs in themselves or in a friend, and encourages help-seeking behavior. So before students or a family member is in crisis, we want them to understand, they may be struggling with a mental health condition and how to seek help. you know, and it also is a suicide prevention program. And then we have NAMI on campus clubs as well throughout the state, and it's a mental health awareness and advocacy club. And right now we're working with LA Unified School District and many other school districts around the state. Next, please. And then NAMI in the Lobby is a program where volunteers, they will table in a hospital or a clinic with inpatient psychiatric unit. So people who are not sure how to navigate the mental health system, we provide support, materials, information to help them on their journey. And then Family and Parent Voice is a speakers bureau that includes family members and parents who speak in the public about mental illness and are a resource to other family members. And I mentioned we do law enforcement training. So in Los Angeles, for example, we work with the LA Police Department, the LA Sheriff's Department, and we're part of their law enforcement crisis intervention training. And we're basically the case study. So we pair a family member and a peer who lives with a mental illness who may have had justice involvement. And they talk about what it's like and, you know, to live with a mental health condition. And if they were justice involved, what went right, what went wrong, and how to help law enforcement understand how to talk to someone who may be hearing voices, who may be in a mental health crisis. So this is something that we also do, you know, all across the state as well. Next slide. And all of our programs and classes are free of charge to the public. So you can find any affiliate around the country at NAMI.org, NAMI.org. And NAMI is here to help anyone on their journey with mental illness, any family member, and encourage everyone to reach out and connect with their local affiliate. I will mention we have a lot of new programs coming out, culturally aware programs. We have a new mental health training for the Black community as well as for the Hispanic community. We have Chinese support groups in Mandarin and other languages around the state as well, depending on the affiliate. Next. And so again, you can find out more at NAMI.org. And thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Trotty, for your presentation. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Commissioner Filer for any public comment.
Thank you for your presentation. Again, some public comment reminders. You may request to speak on an agenda item by raising your hand on Zoom. If you are joining on a computer, you can raise your hand by pressing the raise hand button and on the bottom of your screen. If you are on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. And again, it's questions and comments related to our two speakers that just presented. So do we have anyone in the room who would like to provide a public comment or question? Raise your hand, please. Rebecca, any written comments? Okay. Do we have any on Zoom?
Yes, Dana Hurst.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. And Dana, I've allowed you to talk, so you can go ahead and proceed.
She's showing still on mute.
Yes, I've asked her to unmute. So Dana, if you're there, if you could please unmute your button, and then we'll be able to hear you in the room and in the webinar. She is still not muted herself.
Okay, any other comments on Zoom?
No other raised hands.
Okay, why don't we see if we have any comments that Monica received through email? And we can go back to Dana. Anything?
No verbal
Okay, no verbal.
or no written comment.
No written comments. Okay. do we want to try her one more time on Zoom? And if not, we'll open it up to commissioners who might have some questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, thank
Okay,
you.
thank you for trying again. Some technical difficulties there. First of all, I want to thank everybody who's spoken today. Your presentations have been so valuable and important. I am a PhD student at UCLA affiliated with the Initiative to Study Hate, looking at disability and hate-based phenomena. But I'm also affiliated with, at UC Berkeley, the Disability Lab run by Karen Nakamura, where it's a space for disabled students by disabled students. And my question mostly for Eric. First of all, the DRC is amazing. Thank you for everything that you do. What I'm wondering about is, particularly with people with disabilities, and of course, when I'm talking about this, I'm acknowledging that it intersects with so many other axes of identity, so not just in isolation, but people with disabilities are so often sort of socialized to almost like normalize what we would think of is actually hate speech, right? Like derogatory kind of speech, even ableist slurs, let's say. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, Mr. Harris, but most, some people would tolerate it in a classroom or a public space, and so I'm wondering how is it possible? A question that I've had for a long time is, how would we even get to a point where people would know to call it hate speech, would know to identify, hold on, that's not right. And then, of course, the level of institutional betrayal that disabled people experience is a lot higher. So then, of course, the next stage would be, how do we trust that the response will be just? But I just wanted to put that out there because that's something that I'm really having trouble figuring out. Thank you all again so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dana. This is Eric speaking. The two quick things that come to mind. One, we have to call it out right away. The same way that we would call out racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. We need to call out ableism and ableist hate language immediately and make sure that people are held accountable right away. The second thing that I would recommend as an idea is that we have as many people with disabilities in decision-making roles and on committees and commissions throughout the state and throughout the country. And when that happens, when there are people with disabilities, especially intersectional people with disabilities in these positions, they can hold their colleagues accountable. They can consistently send the message that that ableist language and that hate language, derogatory language about the disability community will not be tolerated, that there will not be an us versus them or an otherism of disabled people. And we see it and hear it consistently all the time, whether it's in big important meetings, whether it's on television shows, how we refer to people who are unhoused, how we refer to people who have certain types of disabilities. And we need to be better about making sure that our rhetoric and the language that we use is appropriate and uplifting. And I think that starts with making sure that more disabled people are in these roles and advising folks who make important decisions. And that includes folks who are elected officials. It includes people who are in teaching roles, teachers, professors. All of these folks can be benefited by having more disabled people in their circle and giving them advice.
Thank you so much, Mr. Harris. Thank you for that. And thank you for all the comments and questions. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move into
Well, I think some of the.
Yeah, we're gonna
commissioners-
go ahead and move to the commissioners if any of them
Okay.
have any questions.
Thanks, Regina, sorry.
It's okay. Any commissioners have any questions? Commissioner Sinar?
Thank you both for your presentations. I had a question related to finding mental health resources, especially for folks who have a cultural or linguistic or other barrier. So currently, and I understand California Against Hate, which is the hotline and helpline started by the Civil Rights Department, aims to do this. But if somebody in the state who doesn't have health insurance, has a need for therapy or other mental health services after a hate incident or hate crime, are there resources on NAMI's website or other public websites or services that you know of where someone can access a counselor or assistant or just find any kind of mental health assistance in their community, especially culturally competent mental health care? What are the best resources existing to be able to do that?
I can answer that. Every NAMI affiliate has their own resources for their community. So if you go again on NAMI.org and look up the affiliate closest to you, they will probably have some on their website, but you can also call their helpline as well. On NAMI.org, there are a lot of national resources as well, and many to different cultures as well. So I would encourage that. And if anyone is in crisis, there's also 988, the new 3-digit mental health and suicide prevention line, and they also have resources as well specific to each community.
Thank you.
Oh, hang on one.
The problem of recovery with stigma, when you don't want the interventions and it's like a joke and stuff. And so the stigma and the stereotyping you can come from, they have it in politics and stuff. So recovery is a tough one when you actually, you can't be on the services anymore. And so, okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your comment, sir. Okay, and if that's all, we're going to go ahead and move to agenda item number 5. And with this is public comment and discussion, and this is for anything that was not on the agenda today. So again, I'd like to just emphasize the part of the commissioner's work, the foundation of the commissioner's work is really community input. So I really would like to just emphasize, we want to hear from as many people, as many community members as we can. So please don't, if you don't want to come up, you can also email. If you don't feel comfortable speaking, you can also email the commission at csh@calcivilrights.ca.gov. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Commissioner Filer for any public comments.
Okay, once again, I want to remind people that this is an opportunity to provide a public comment related to optional guiding questions that will be shared. I'm not quite sure how this goes.
If you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. All right. So this is the opportunity for any questions, for optional questions that anyone has. I think I'm not handling this correctly.
You're doing perfectly fine.
Okay. Okay, please keep in mind that the commission may not discuss or act in any matter raised during the public comment section that is not included on this agenda, except whether to decide to place the matter on the agenda of a future meeting. So we're going to move into facilitated public comment and discussion. So are there any questions that we have from the people in the room? Is that how we handle it at this point?
That's right.
Okay. Yes. Excuse me, I got a little confused at this at this point.
CC, before public comment, can we release our speakers that are on, or would we like them to stay on?
Oh, yeah, I think we can release them. If they would like to stay on, they're welcome to, but yes, and thank you to all of our speakers for incredible presentations.
Yes.
I think we
thank
should
you.
thank them.
And to the commissioners who organized it and the staff.
All right, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, good up. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, good afternoon, Madam Chair and member of the commission. My name is Sari Thapapon. I'm the president and CEO of the ABLE Community Development Foundation. And personally, I am a refugee coming from Laos back in 1979. And I settled in the Bay Area, but I get involved with the community for a long, long time. And I just moved to Sacramento 2 years ago. And as a president of the organization, I work with mainly Southeast Asian community and people, namely people from Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. And we had a program we involved in the senior population, youth, and the family. And I'm very glad this is the first time that I attending this meeting. So I personally agree with all the presenter in terms of the issue, in terms of the problem at community or neighborhood level. And when we're talking about discrimination or hate, or lately, seeing the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic that affect all of us, and regardless of who we are. But as a result of that, because of the issue, the pandemic or the virus originate from China, as we all knew. But because of that, people who don't really know the difference between the Asian country, Asian people, they all lump us into be a Chinese. As a result of that, many of the Asian people, because we look alike, okay, the Laotian look alike the Thai or the Vietnamese or the Chinese, but people who don't know us tend to look at us, we are Chinese. And plus, historically, the Chinese community or Chinese people with the first Asian immigrant or people who came to this country and they were part of the society. And at the community level, at the neighborhood level, there's quite a issue between different race, different ethnicity, especially in the public school. My son, I lost my son as a result of the mental health issue because he was okay when he attending the elementary school. He's okay, but as soon as he start middle school or junior high school at one of the it's called Aham Middle School that located in San Pablo and West Contra Costa County.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm just going to give you a time warning and also let you know that this is an important issue that really would be valuable to also call into our hotline to update us on the issues that you are facing. So
yeah,
we're going to have
perhaps
wrap it up.
Perhaps when I look at the agenda, and I would suggest in the future meeting item of the commission,
yeah,
would look at the impact of the COVID-19, how it affects the race in our society, and how the issue divide us as a community, as a people, between the Asian, Black, white, or Hispanic. I really want the commission to take time to take a look at the statewide level and especially at the community level. Perhaps we can invite the expert or people who engage with the issue to come and present
Yes.
information to the commission.
Thank you. So,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
And as an organization, I also try to work with the Asian community in Sacramento as well as the Central Valley, like Fresno, Stockton. We have quite a big number from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Laos, who live in Fresno County, Stockton or San Quentin County, as well as Sacramento.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Quite a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm gonna need to have you wrap it up. But you know, if you want to leave with us your information, thank you for that important and valuable.
Also, I would like to really get to know this unit. I want to work with them and.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your comments and
Really
again,
valuable.
we will.
It's tough to take the stereotyping, like can't be on the services, so I don't need the intervention. It's kind of a joke in the public. So thank you. All right.
Okay,
Thank you for that. Thank you for your comment.
yeah,
And we'll make sure that, so you get the resources that you need for the conflict resolution team.
yes, yes, very important. Thank you. Do we have any other comments via Zoom? Oh, we have another, I'm sorry, in the room. Forgive me, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for holding this. I just want to do a quick introduction of myself. This is my first time being here. But my name is Billy Gowerty, and I'm a program director at Asian Resources, Inc., or ARI for short. We're a community-based organization here in Sacramento with 3 locations. We're actually a member of the Transformative Grant as well. And just to give you a small update, we work with about 10 other community partners as well. The work that we've been able to do in this past 6 months or so has been really impactful in helping with the steps of intervention and prevention. It's been a great summer of hosting multiple youth-focused programs, reaching out to different hard-to-reach communities as well, offering things like Tai Chi, free yoga classes, just community events at our community center in South Sac that has been, really imperative to making sure that different ethnic groups and people from different backgrounds have a place to go and be safe and be able to explore their different cultural backgrounds and whatnot. Just wanted to introduce myself and say hi, and thank you so much for holding this forum.
Thank you. Thank you for that information.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions in the room? Any written comments or questions, Rebecca? No? Okay. Now we'll move over to Zoom. Any?
No hands raised.
Okay, no hands. Okay, great. And Monica, any from phone?
No written public comment.
Okay. And I guess Commissioner Quayler, should I turn it over to you?
Yeah, and I'm going to turn it over to any of the commissioners if they want to say anything before we move on to the next agenda item.
Yeah, just real briefly. It would be a crime if I didn't mention Stop AAPI Hate, because we have a commissioner who has done a beautiful job with that organization. So please check that. Also, the website of my prior center, which I am no longer affiliated with, Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, did special reports on anti-Asian hate crime. And there's just a slew of information, including some excellent social science research done by other folks. So please check those. And also, I would be remiss if I left out the Asian American Bar Association. Those are 3 wonderful places to get information.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Levin. Commissioner Roybal, I believe you had something.
I did. I just wanted to extend my thanks to all of the speakers on behalf of the commission, and especially to thank you, Commissioners Cuellar and Filer, for putting together a fantastic community forum today. It was amazing. I actually want to watch it again. In particular, some of the statistics and data information shared. So thank you very much for doing this.
Well, thank you all for being here. And I mean, we wouldn't be able to get this done without all of the staff behind, which is our CRD Civil Rights Department and our conflict resolution team, especially Christina Texera. She was here earlier today, but she did leave. And I just want to make sure that we extend a huge gratitude to her because she was really instrumental in moving this forum. And, you know, we all are pretty busy in other things, but she was really instrumental in moving it and getting us here today. So I want to make sure that we thank her and all of the CRD team for all their help and everything that they do for us. So thank you so much. Thank you. And with that, we're going to go ahead and go into agenda item number 6, adjournment. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Commissioner Filer.
Well, I think we've kind of said it all. We were wanting to thank our speakers and presenters. I think they have left already, but to Dr. Meyer, Dr. Bath, Eric Harris, and Trot Winters, truly thank you for remarkable presentations. I've learned a lot, and I think hopefully we'll be able to have this on YouTube, you said, for other people to access it or to share with their communities. Thank you to the people who attended, and thank you for your comments. And I think
Yes, a big thank you to all the community members that were here and stayed throughout the presentation. Again, this is what these community forums are here. We really want to hear from you, the community, and any issues and concerns you have. This is what we are here for. So sorry to interrupt, Commissioner Filer.
No. And the people on Zoom who attended.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And with that, we'll adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you.